Tasha Williams sat in her car, her hands gripping the steering wheel as the headlights of the vehicle in her rearview mirror flashed on and off. She had just finished a long shift at the hospital where she had been on her feet for hours helping save lives, fixing broken bones, and doing everything in her power to give her patients a fighting chance. It was late, and she was exhausted, but she knew that the road home was just a few miles away. She could make it through the last stretch of the day without any issues. But as she switched lanes to pass a slower car, she noticed the flicker of blue lights behind her in the mirror. A sigh left her lips as she instinctively pulled over to the side of the road. She wasn't speeding or doing anything dangerous yet. Somehow she had still been spotted. She could feel the fatigue in her body dragging her down, but she forced herself to sit up straight as the officer approached her window. Tasha rolled it down slowly, a polite smile playing on her face, though she felt an uneasy twinge in her gut. She had seen it too many times before, officers stopping people late at night for reasons that often felt trivial or unjustified. She could already feel the tension creeping into the air, but she kept her voice steady when she greeted him. "Good evening, officer." The officer, a tall man with dark hair and a uniform that seemed just a little too stiff, nodded his head and started speaking without much of a greeting or introduction. "Man, do you know why I pulled you over?" Tasha's heart skipped a beat as she felt a slight pang of nervousness. Despite her usual calm demeanor, she had a long shift at the hospital where lives were on the line, and this man was asking her about a traffic violation. It didn't seem right. "I didn't signal when I changed lanes," she responded, hoping to keep things simple, hoping that he would let her off with a warning. But the officer's face didn't soften. Instead, it became more stern. He looked down at his ticket book before looking back at her with an almost dismissive look that left her feeling even more uncomfortable. "I'm writing you a ticket," he said, his voice cold, and without much explanation. Tasha blinked in disbelief, trying to process the situation. "I'm really sorry. I was just trying to get home after work," she said, her voice calm. But her patience, starting to thin. The officer barely seemed to listen as he scribbled on his pad and handed her the ticket, his eyes not once meeting hers. She stared at the citation for a moment, unable to wrap her mind around what was happening here. She had spent the whole day in the operating room dealing with life and death, and now she was being penalized for a simple mistake that anyone could have made, even if she wasn't a doctor. But here she was standing before a man who didn't seem to care about her explanation or who she was as a person, just another driver who had made a mistake. She took the ticket with a quiet nod, and without saying another word, she started her car and drove off, not looking back at the officer, who had already turned his attention to the next car passing by. A heavy weight settled on her shoulders as she thought about the unfairness of it all, but she shook her head, knowing she couldn't let herself be dragged down by this small moment in time. After all, there were bigger things waiting for her tomorrow at the hospital. The weeks passed, and the incident with the ticket felt like a distant memory to Tasha, though it still lingered in the back of her mind. She threw herself back into her work at the hospital, where every day brought new challenges. As a trauma surgeon, she had seen it all: car accidents, gunshot wounds, heart attacks, but nothing ever truly prepared her for the emotional toll of the job. Still, she loved it, loved the feeling of making a real difference in people's lives. Yet, even in a field where saving lives was the goal, she couldn't escape the shadows of prejudice and bias that seemed to follow her no matter where she went. She didn't think much of the fine at first. It was just a minor inconvenience, something to handle and move on from. But the date to appear in court had come, and now she found herself walking into the same courthouse that she had walked past countless times without a second thought. She adjusted her coat, straightened her posture, and entered the cold, sterile room. As she sat down, she couldn't help but notice the familiar faces of other defendants. She was the only one who stood out, the only black woman in a sea of people waiting for their cases to be heard. The judge, Gregory Hall, sat high on his bench, his stern face scanning the room with an air of authority. He had a reputation for being tough, quick to make decisions, and even quicker to pass down fines. It was no secret that he often sided with the police officers who filled the courtrooms. Tasha didn't mind. She had been in the courtroom before as a witness, but never on the other side. She just wanted this to be over, and the sooner she could get back to the hospital, the better. When the officer took the stand, he gave his version of the story. He explained how Tasha had failed to signal before changing lanes and how she had been difficult during the interaction. Tasha had to hold back her frustration as she listened to the officer exaggerate the facts. She wasn't being difficult. She was simply explaining her situation. The officer didn't want to hear her explanation. It was easier for him to label her as uncooperative, as if her calm response was somehow a sign of disrespect. When her turn came, she stood and spoke with quiet confidence. She told the judge that she was exhausted from a long shift at the hospital and had made an honest mistake. She wasn't trying to break the law or cause trouble. She was simply tired and eager to get home. She could feel the weight of the room shift slightly as her words hung in the air, but she didn't expect it to be enough. She had seen this type of courtroom interaction before, and she knew how it would end. Judge Hall didn't look at her. He glanced down at the paperwork in front of him, nodded curtly, and then turned his attention back to the officer. Without saying much else, he made his decision. "Guilty," he said flatly, his voice echoing in the room. "You'll be fined the full amount." Court dismissed. Tasha felt a wave of disappointment wash over her. There was no understanding, no compassion, just an immediate dismissal. She tried to hold back the anger that bubbled up inside her, but it was hard. It felt unjust, as though her words had meant nothing. Her fatigue from the long hours in the hospital seemed to be matched by the weight of the injustice she felt now. She had hoped for a fair hearing, but it seemed that hope had been in vain. As she gathered her things and walked out of the courtroom, the fine in hand, she couldn't shake the feeling of having been judged not for who she was, but for the assumptions that had been made about her from the very start. The courtroom experience lingered in Tasha's mind long after she had left. She sat in her car in the parking lot, the fine in her glove compartment, still struggling to understand how something so small had been blown out of proportion. The anger was still there, simmering under the surface. But there was something else, too, an exhaustion that went beyond the physical toll of her demanding job. It was the kind of fatigue that settled in your bones, the kind that only grew worse when you were made to feel like you didn't belong. As a surgeon, Tasha had always been used to proving herself. She had worked harder than most, spent years studying, long nights in the OR, countless sacrifices to get to where she was. She had become one of the top trauma surgeons in the country, saving lives daily in a high-stakes environment where every second mattered. But it was still the little things, the seemingly insignificant moments, that always made her feel like an outsider. She arrived home late that night, too tired to do much more than drop her coat on the couch and throw her shoes in a corner. Her apartment was quiet, and for a moment, she let herself sit in a stillness, letting the weight of the day settle around her. Then her phone buzzed, and a text from Dr. Ethan Patterson one of her colleagues from the hospital, lit up the screen. K Tasha, just saw the article about the court case. Are you okay? Let me know if you need to talk. We all support you. Tasha stared at the message for a long moment. She wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't want to dwell on it, didn't want to give it more attention than it deserved. But she knew she couldn't just brush it aside. The case, her experience, was already making headlines, and it wasn't just about a simple traffic violation anymore. The conversation had shifted to something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. She sat down at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. A quick search on her newsfeed confirmed that the story had gone viral. It was everywhere. Headlines like "Black Woman Fined by White Judge in What Appears to be Racial Profiling" and "Renowned Surgeons Stopped for a Minor Traffic Violation" filled her screen. She clicked on one of the articles, and as she read, she realized the case was quickly gaining traction. People were outraged. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, at least not like this. Her reputation as a surgeon was well known in medical circles, but outside of the hospital, she was just another face in the crowd. Until now. The story of her fine was turning into something much larger. It was becoming a conversation about race, about the systemic biases that so many Black people faced every day, whether in the courtroom, at work, or in the street. But as she read the comments from people who felt the same frustrations she did, she felt something else stirring within her, a strange combination of disbelief, anger, and perhaps a bit of empowerment. It was one thing to face challenges on your own, but when you saw others stand with you, when you realized that you weren't alone in your fight, something changed. It was like a fire had been lit inside her, one that wasn't going to burn out so easily. Tasha closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. Her eyes closed for a moment, and she took a deep breath. The injustice she had faced was not just about her. It was about a system that was broken. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment that could make a difference. It was time to do something about it, not just for her, but for the countless others who were dealing with the same unfair treatment. Tomorrow was a new day, and it would be the beginning of something different. Judge Gregory Hall sat in his study, his back leaning against the worn leather chair, a glass of scotch in his hand. It was a quiet evening, the kind he usually enjoyed after a busy day in court. He had just wrapped up a few cases, some straightforward, some not so much, and now he was winding down. But as he flicked through his phone, scrolling through the news, something caught his eye. A headline stopped him cold. Asterisk judge finds black woman, only to learn she's a renowned surgeon asterisk. His thumb froze over the screen as he stared at the headline. His eyes narrowed as he read the accompanying article. The woman in the story was Dr. Tasha Williams, the same woman who had appeared in his courtroom just days ago, the woman he had dismissed without a second thought. The article went on to highlight her successful career as one of the top trauma surgeons in the country, a woman who had saved countless lives and built a reputation as a leader in her field. Gregory's stomach churned. He had been so quick to pass judgment that day in court, so certain that the officer's account was the whole truth. But now, reading about Tasha's achievements, her years of hard work and dedication, he felt a deep sense of regret. He had never thought to ask about her background, to consider who she was beyond the defendant sitting before him in that sterile courtroom. He set his glass down on the table, his fingers still gripping the edge, his mind racing. How had he missed this? How had he failed to see the person behind the ticket, behind the tired eyes? It didn't matter that she was a doctor. She was still a human being, deserving of fairness and understanding. His thoughts turned back to that moment in the courtroom. He had been impatient, quick to side with the officer, dismissing Tasha's words with barely a glance. He hadn't even given her a chance to explain herself. Now, reading about the growing outrage over the incident, he knew he couldn't let this go. His actions, his dismissal, had contributed to something much larger, a system of inequity, one that had been in place long before he ever took the bench. Gregory rubbed his temples, trying to process everything that had happened. He had always prided himself on being fair, on being impartial. But this was different. He had failed to see the person in front of him. He had failed to take into account the weight of her life, the struggles she must have faced to get where she was. He couldn't just let this be another case that faded into the background. He had to make things right. But how? The question lingered in his mind as he stared out the window, his eyes distant. He had no experience in dealing with issues like this, no training in how to confront his own biases, how to acknowledge his mistakes. But one thing was clear. He had to apologize. He had to make amends for what he had done, for what he hadn't done. He pulled his phone from the table and began typing, his fingers moving slowly as he composed a message to Tasha. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew he couldn't remain silent. Asterisk, dear Dr. Williams. Asterisk. Asterisk, I want to sincerely apologize for my actions in court during your hearing. Upon reflection, I realized that I failed to give you the respect and understanding you deserved. I made assumptions, and I deeply regret my decision. Asterisk. Asterisk, I would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you, if you would allow me, to express my apology in person. Asterisk. Asterisk with respect. Judge Gregory Hall. Asterisk. He stared at the message for a long moment, his finger hovering over the send button. He had no idea how Tasha would respond, but he knew this was the first step towards something better. He pressed send. Tasha's phone buzzed again the following morning, the notification lighting up the screen. She had just finished her early morning rounds of the hospital and was about to head into surgery when she noticed the message from Judge Gregory Hall. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She had enough on her plate already, patients to see, surgeries to perform, and a world of challenges that required her full attention. But something about the message made her pause. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the words. It was an apology. Tasha blinked. For a moment, she wasn't sure what to make of it. She had expected the story to fade away into the background, just another unfortunate incident that would be forgotten after a while. But here, from the man who had fined her weeks ago, was a sincere attempt at acknowledgement. The apology wasn't long or overly elaborate, but there was something genuine in the words that stopped Tasha from brushing it aside. He admitted his mistake. He acknowledged the assumptions he had made and expressed regret for how he had treated her in court. And most importantly, he had taken the first step to correct his wrongs by reaching out personally. Still, part of her was skeptical. People apologize all the time, but that didn't always mean their actions would change. This wasn't just about one fine. It was about a larger pattern of injustice that many Black individuals faced every day. Was this apology truly sincere, or was it an attempt to quiet the growing noise around the case? She stared at the message for a long while before finally deciding to respond. There was no harm in hearing him out, she thought. She could always walk away if it didn't feel right. Judge Hall, thank you for your message. I appreciate the apology and the honesty in your words. I would be open to meeting with you to discuss this further, as long as it is a genuine attempt to understand and learn from the mistake that was made. Best, Tasha Williams. She hit send, feeling a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. What was she expecting from this meeting? She didn't know. But the truth was, something inside her wanted to believe that people were capable of change, that real progress could come from difficult conversations. That afternoon, Tasha found herself sitting in her office, going over a few patient files before heading into surgery, when she received a response. Judge Hall had accepted her invitation to meet, and the meeting was set for the following week. The days leading up to their meeting were filled with anticipation. Tasha didn't want to hold on to the resentment she had been feeling, but she couldn't help it. She had fought for everything she had, every step forward in her career, every acknowledgement of her expertise, every inch of respect she had earned was hard-won. The idea of a judge, someone who held the power to shape people's lives with one decision, so easily dismissing her without taking the time to see her for who she was, had stung deeply. She wasn't sure what to expect from the meeting. Was this man truly ready to listen, or was he just seeking to smooth things over for the sake of his reputation? She wasn't sure, but she had a feeling the conversation would be more than just words. It would be a moment of reckoning for both of them. As the date of their meeting approached, Tasha found herself reflecting on how much she had already overcome. She had spent years earning the right to be called a surgeon. She had endured countless challenges, both professionally and personally, and this meeting with Judge Hall would be just one more hurdle to face. She wasn't sure what would come of it, but she was determined to meet it head-on. When the time came, she would be ready. The day of the meeting arrived, and Tasha found herself standing in front of the courthouse once again. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to be in this space. The sterile walls, the quiet hum of official business in the air, the weight of judgment hanging over every word spoken in the rooms. Today, though, she wasn't here as a defendant, but as someone seeking clarity. She had agreed to meet with Judge Hall, but now, as she stood in front of the courthouse doors, she couldn't deny the anxiety that crept into her chest. Tasha took a deep breath, adjusting the blazer she wore, and walked inside. The meeting had been arranged for late afternoon, when the courthouse was quieter, and it would be just the two of them in a small conference room. She arrived early, wanting to gather her thoughts before facing the man who had, in her eyes, represented so much of the flawed system that continued to treat people like her as less than. As she entered the room, she found herself staring at Judge Gregory Hall, who was already seated at the table. He looked different outside of the courtroom. There were no robes, no stern looks from the bench. He was dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, his tie slightly loosened, his posture less rigid, but his eyes, still sharp and observant, looked at her with an air of sincerity that she had yet to fully trust. "Dr. Williams," he said, standing to greet her. His voice, though still authoritative, lacked the coldness she had felt during their last encounter. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Tasha nodded but didn't offer her hand to shake. She wasn't sure what to make of this meeting, and she wasn't going to pretend she was comfortable with it just yet. "Thank you for reaching out," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm here because I think it's important to address what happened, and I hope we can have a real conversation about it." Hall gestured for her to take a seat. She did so, her posture just as straight as his. For a moment, the room was silent, the air heavy with unspoken words. "I've been reflecting on that day in your courtroom," he began after a pause. "And I realize now that I made a series of mistakes. I acted hastily, and I didn't take into account who you are, your background, or the exhaustion you were carrying with you that day. I just saw another violation to address and moved on, without understanding the full context. I regret that deeply." Tasha studied him closely, her mind processing his words. This wasn't the defensive tone she had expected. There was no attempt to justify his actions, no dismissal of her feelings. She could hear the sincerity in his voice. It was a start, but it wasn't enough just yet. "Regret is a good first step," Tasha said, her voice calm but firm. "But it's not just about one mistake in one courtroom. This isn't just about me. It's about the system you represent, the system that makes it easy for people to be dismissed, to be treated unfairly, without thought, based on assumptions that have nothing to do with who they really are." Hall's eyes softened as she spoke, and she could see him absorbing her words, his mind working through the weight of them. "I understand that," he said quietly. "I can't undo what's been done, but I want to learn. I want to change how I approach these cases. I want to do better by the people who come before me, regardless of their background, their race, their career. No one should be treated like they don't matter." Tasha felt a flicker of something in her chest. Hope, maybe. She had heard these kinds of promises before, but rarely had they felt so genuine. It's not just about changing how you see things. It's about how the entire system operates. If you truly want to make a difference, you'll need to look at the way things are structured, the biases that influence every decision made in these walls. It's a start, but it's not enough to make one apology and call it a day. Real change takes more. Judge Hall nodded slowly, his expression contemplative. "I understand, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to ensure that my court reflects the values of fairness and equality, not just for you, but for everyone who walks through those doors." The conversation continued, a dialogue that was more than just words, but an exchange of ideas, frustrations, and a shared desire for progress. By the end of the meeting, Tasha didn't feel as though everything had been resolved, but she did feel something new, a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind for Tasha. She threw herself back into her work at the hospital, the high-energy pace of trauma surgery, a welcome distraction from the emotional roller coaster of the courtroom encounter. Yet, despite her dedication to her patients, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within her. The meeting with Judge Hall had opened a door, one that had led her to think not only about her own experience, but also about the larger issues that she, and so many others, faced every day. Judge Hall had kept his word. Tasha noticed small changes around the courthouse, subtle shifts in the way cases were handled. There were discussions about racial biases and the need for cultural competency training among judges and court staff. The media coverage of her case continued, but it had evolved into something more profound. It was no longer just about a single traffic violation. It had sparked conversations about systemic racism and inequality within the justice system. Tasha knew her role in all of this wasn't over. The conversation was still unfolding, and she was determined to keep it going. Meanwhile, Judge Hall took active steps to educate himself. He sought out opportunities to attend workshops on implicit bias, diversity, and criminal justice reform. He consulted with colleagues, experts, and community leaders, listening to their experiences and gaining a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by people from marginalized communities. He even made a point of reaching out to Tasha again, not to apologize, but to invite her to participate in a panel discussion about the intersection of race and the law. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that he was genuinely trying to do more than just say the right things. Tasha hesitated at first. The idea of speaking publicly about her experience, about the toll it had taken on her, was daunting. She had never been one to seek attention, but she also realized that her story had become part of a much larger conversation. It wasn't just about one woman and a traffic ticket. It was about a system that had often failed to see people like her as equals. She couldn't walk away from that, not now. She agreed to participate in the panel, knowing that her voice, as a surgeon and as a Black woman, could contribute to something much bigger than herself. The day of the panel arrived, and Tasha stood before a room full of people, lawyers, activists, judges, and concerned citizens, waiting for the conversation to begin. Judge Hall was there, sitting in the front row, looking as though he was taking this moment seriously. As she took the microphone and shared her story, she felt a sense of empowerment that she had never experienced before. The audience listened intently, and she could feel the weight of her words settling in the room. She spoke about the frustrations of being treated as less than, of constantly having to prove her worth. She spoke about the emotional toll of her career and the daily battles that most people never saw. When it was Judge Hall's turn to speak, there was no defensiveness, no excuses. He admitted his past mistakes, acknowledging the ways in which his position of power had perpetuated injustice, even in small moments like the one in their courtroom. The audience was moved by his humility, and Tasha saw a sincerity in his eyes that made her believe he was committed to changing the way he operated. After the event, as people filtered out, Tasha found herself speaking with others who had been inspired by the conversation. There was a sense of hope in the air, a belief that change was possible if people were willing to listen, learn, and act. It wasn't an easy process, but it was a start. And in that moment, Tasha realized that her experience, painful as it had become part of something larger than herself, a movement toward justice, toward understanding, and toward a future where everyone, no matter their background, could be seen for who they truly were. Months passed since the panel discussion, and Tasha's life slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. Yet the impact of what had transpired still lingered, like a faint but ever-present hum in the background of her days. The conversation she had started, the relationships she had forged, and the changes that had been set in motion were all pieces of something larger than just her own personal story. They were part of a collective effort to reshape the system that had allowed biases and inequalities to persist unchecked for far too long. Tasha had become an unexpected voice in the fight for justice reform. Her story, initially just about a traffic ticket, had evolved into a symbol of the countless invisible struggles faced by marginalized communities. She was invited to speak at conferences, participate in discussions, and collaborate with various organizations focused on social justice. But despite all the attention, she remained deeply grounded in her work as a surgeon. The operating room was where she felt most herself, where she had always been able to make an immediate, tangible difference in the lives of her patients. It was here, in the quiet urgency of saving lives, that she felt most connected to her true purpose. Judge Hall, for his part, had become a catalyst for change in his own sphere. He had gone on to push for reforms in the court system, advocating for training that focused on empathy, cultural competency, and the recognition of implicit bias. His efforts were far from perfect, but they were a start. He often reached out to Tasha, seeking advice, asking her to share her perspective on issues affecting the community. Their conversations were no longer about blame or regret, but about how they could move forward together, shaping a future where fairness and equity weren't just ideals but realities. It was a rainy afternoon when Tasha received an unexpected phone call from Judge Hall. He was calling to inform her of an initiative he was spearheading, one that aimed to change the way traffic violations and minor offenses were handled in the court system. It was a bold idea. Rather than relying solely on fines and penalties, they would explore restorative justice practices, offering individuals the opportunity to engage in community service, education, and reconciliation programs. The goal was to reduce the cycle of punitive measures that disproportionately affected Black and brown individuals and instead offer a path toward rehabilitation and healing. "I want you to be part of this, Tasha." Judge Hall's voice crackled through the phone. "I believe you can help guide this program and ensure it reflects the needs of those who've been left behind by the system. Your experience, your perspective, it's crucial." Tasha listened quietly, her heart beating a little faster. This was the kind of change she had wanted to see, a move away from punitive measures toward a system that emphasized healing and understanding. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, that there would be obstacles, resistance, and setbacks. But she also knew that real change required people to take bold risks and face uncomfortable truths. And this was an opportunity to do just that. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm with conviction. "Let's make it happen." The next few years were filled with challenges, triumphs, and setbacks as Tasha and Judge Hall worked together to implement the restorative justice program. It wasn't always easy, but every small victory felt like a step toward breaking down the walls of the old system and building something new, something better. They had their share of critics, but they also had a growing community of advocates who believed in what they were trying to achieve. And as Tasha stood in front of a room full of people one evening, sharing the story of how a simple traffic ticket had turned into a movement for justice, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The work was far from over, but it had begun with a single conversation. And now that conversation was rippling out, touching lives and changing the course of the future. Tasha had always known the power of healing. She had spent her career mending broken bodies. But now she was part of something bigger. She was helping heal a broken system, one step at a time.